And one of the great ironies about Shavuot, which is Zman Matan Toratenu, the time of the giving of our Torah, is that there's absolutely no mention in the Torah of Shavuot as being Zman Matan Toratenu, the time of giving of the Torah. The Shavuot is framed in the Torah with its agricultural aspects, and it's not at all discussed anywhere in the Torah as being the time of the giving of the Torah. So there's something very ironic about the fact that the birthday of the Torah, which is celebrated on Shavuot, the Torah itself does not mention that as being the day in which the Torah was given. That's based upon the oral law. And it seems to be that there's something very purposeful about the fact that we have to turn to the Torah Sheba'al Peh, the oral Torah, in order to know the birthday of the written Torah. In other words, the very inception of the written law, we only know about in terms of the event, when the event took place, through the Torah Sheba'al Peh, through the oral law. And I think that conveys the inseparable relationship between the written Torah and the oral Torah from inception itself. So what I'd like to do today is to spend a few minutes analyzing the notion of oral law, particularly with respect to, there's a lot to talk about, which maybe on another occasion we'll discuss the whole concept in a very wide sense of the notion of Torah Sheba'al Peh, of the oral law. But I want to specifically focus on why it is that there's this notion of this part of the Torah that you're not allowed to write down. Where does that come from? And more particularly, why? Why is it that theoretically, at least, we were not allowed to write down the oral law? So let's first take a look at the source in the Talmud for the prohibition of writing down the oral law. So the Gemara in Masechet Gittin says the following: Darash Rabbi Yehuda bar Nachmani. So Rabbi Yehuda bar Nachmani explained based upon a verse. And who was he? Meturgamane, the Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish. He was the Meturgaman of Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish. The Meturgaman was a post which existed in Talmudic times for great scholars who would give a lecture in front of a lot of people in a big room. They didn't have electric amplification systems. And so the speaker would speak in a soft voice, save their throat, and you would have someone who had a very dynamic voice would then repeat what the speaker would say in a way which the whole crowd could hear it. As a matter of fact, according to some interpretations, not only it was a kind of human amplification system, but in fact, the speaker would speak in Lashon HaKodesh, in Hebrew, and the Meturgaman would not only amplify it, but translate it into the language that most people could understand, like, for instance, in Aramaic. So in any case, the Rabbi Yehuda bar Nachmani explains the following psukim. So the Torah says the following, Parshat Ki Tisa, Ketiv Ketov Lacha Kedvarim Ha'ela. It says in the Torah that Moshe is commanded by God, write these words, referring to the Torah, write these words. The only problem is that in the same pasuk, it says, Uchtiv ki al pi hadvarim ha'ela. It says al pi. Al pi means by the mouth. By the mouth, these things. Now, I just want to point out that in modern Hebrew, it would give you a much better sense of this phrase, al pi. When we say that you know something ba'al peh, what does that mean in contemporary Hebrew, if you know something ba'al peh?
You know it by heart.
You know it by heart. So that's really what this means here, that ki al pi advarim ha'ela, al pi means by heart. So, haketzad, is the Torah supposed to be ketov lecha, write down, or is it supposed to be al pi, right, by heart? It's an inner contradiction. It's one or the other. So the Talmud answers, dvarim shebichtav that which was transmitted to Moshe in writing, iyata rashai la'omram al peh. They cannot be said by heart. Udvarim sheba'al peh, and the things which were transmitted to Moshe orally, the oral law, the explanations, etc., iyata rashai la'omram bichtav. They can't be transmitted in written form. The Rabbi Yishmael Tana, the school of Rabbi Yishmael used to teach it based upon a slightly different derivation. So when it says al pi hadvarim ha'ela, right, the word ela atakotev. So when the Torah says, ketov l'cha hadvarim ha'ela, write these things. So why ela, these things? Ela atakotev, it's to circumscribe and limit. These things you should write. Via takotev halachot. You shouldn't write the halachot, which means the oral law. So a couple of things I want to just clarify here. This prohibition on writing down Torah Sheba'al Peh is derived, we see here, in two different ways, right? It could be based upon the word Ela. It could be based upon the fact that it says in one part of the pasuk al pi, which means by heart, and the other part it says ketov, you should write. I just want to point out methodology. This is a very important notion when trying to understand these midrashim, right? This is a midrash halacha. Okay, midrash doesn't mean a baba maisa, right? Midrash means information which is conveyed in conjunction with a pasuk from Tanakh. That's what a midrash is by definition. If it has halachic content, it's a midrash halacha. If it has non-halachic content, it's midrash agada. So this midrash halacha here, there are several different forms of the midrash, darshaning, that good English word, darshaning different parts of the pasuk. Now, when I was in yeshiva, my Rebbe there, Rav Yehuda Pardes, so he pointed out that at least in the school that he was trained in, he was a student of Rabbi Soloveitchik, that to not spend a lot of time trying to understand specifically the mechanism of the drasha, how the specific halacha is derived from the pasuk. Well, why not? So the first reason is, that Rav Parnas explained, is that we really don't have anymore a clear understanding of the methodology of drash. I'm sure all of you have been learning Torah for years, and I'm sure many times you've seen how the Talmud, or Midrash Agadah, or Midrash Halacha, in this case Midrash Halacha, when it derives a halacha from a pasuk, you sort of scratch your head and say, you're kidding. That's what the pasuk is saying? How is that derived from the pasuk? And sometimes it can seem very far-fetched. So the Kuzari actually explains that we no longer have an understanding. This is the Kuzari writing in the early Middle Ages. That he's already saying that we have lost the tradition of how to explain the methodology of midrash. What's the hermeneutical mechanism by which these laws are derived from psukim? That's number one. Number two, many times the Talmud itself will analyze a midrashic derivation and end up saying, oh, you know what? That pasuk is only an asmachta, a term you may be familiar with. That in fact, we didn't derive that particular halacha from the pasuk. The halacha pre-existed the pasuk, and we associated after the fact this particular halacha with that pasuk. Why? One of the explanations given is just in order to remember it, to remember the halacha. Remember that halacha given by the oral law, if we can associate it with a pasuk in the written law, it'll help us remember that particular halacha, especially in a time when the oral law wasn't written down. So how are we going to remember it? So we can remember it by organizing it based upon some kind of vague hint, at least, in the written law. So it's the same thing here. When you read this pasuk here and you say, That's telling me I'm not allowed to write down Torah Sheba'al Peh? You're kidding. So so we have to be a little humble about it and not scratch our heads too much. I actually have a big Yetzer Hara to try to understand these things. And there's certain commentaries that like to analyze these things. But for our purposes today, we're not going to explore the exact derivation for the reasons I said before. We don't have the methodology anymore, number one. And number two, it may be an asmachta. It may be that the pasuk is after the fact, and we're just taking this prohibition, which was given to Moshe at Har Sinai, of writing down Torah Sheba'al Peh, and it was like tagged on to this particular pasuk.
Rabbi?
Yes.
Do we imagine that the Torah Sheba'al Peh was taught over all these years in the Midbar, and the written Torah is at the end that Moshe gives to the people, and likewise, he didn't have a set book of notes which represents that Torah Sheba'al Peh, and that's why he doesn't teach from it, or we're not allowed to take also notes on what we're learning? What exactly is this law prescribing us not to do?
Yeah. So, I mean, if I understood your question properly, it what applies to us applied to Moshe too. In other words, Moshe also didn't record the oral law, right? That
But all he had was an oral law before he wrote it down at the end.
Okay, so that's actually that's a dispute in the Talmud. So the Talmud has two opinions on the process of the revelation and recording of even the written law. So the Talmud says that one opinion says Megillah nitna, that as soon as HaKadosh Baruch Hu revealed information that was supposed to be written Torah, that discrete revelation that was given to Moshe, that chapter, we'll call it, he wrote it down right away. And then the next day, there was another revelation. He wrote it down. The next day, another revelation. And then and he wrote it on a cloth, like a Sefer Torah. At the end of the 40 years, he sewed them together, all these different passages written on cloth, on the hide, and voila, then you have a Sefer Torah.
Are you saying that Moshe wrote down the Sefer Torah before God gave us the Torah?
So, okay, so there's two different things. One is the Ten Commandments. We can't confuse the two things. So the Ten Commandments are written in stone, right? But that's just the Big Ten. In terms of the Sefer Torah as we have it, so the way we understand that there are midrashim. I mean, this is what's provoking your question. There are midrashim in which Moshe goes up and he's supposed to be receiving the Torah, and he's getting impatient, and he says to God, "No, what's taking you so long?" And God says, "Well, I'm embellishing the letters, putting these crowns on the letters." And Moshe says, "Why are you doing that?" And he says, "Because there's going to be a Rabbi Akiva who's going to darshan the crowns and letters in the future and derive all kinds of halachot from these crowns and letters." So that sort of implies that God was writing a Sefer Torah. I don't think we...
but I'm talking even before the Decalogue, before Moshe went up to Shemayim, we had the mitzvot of Shabbat, for example. We were given halachot with that. Did Moshe stop, write it down, and that became part of the Torah?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm assuming not. I'm assuming that only from Sinai on was there the process of, we talked about this last week, dictation and then writing it down. But like I was just explaining that it's a machloket in the Talmud whether or not he wrote it down sequentially and then tied it together, or the Gemara says Chatuma Nitna, it's the other opinion, that in fact he memorized it all. So that's an interesting point, and then he only wrote it down at the end of the 40 years, the whole thing at once. So if you hold by that second opinion, Chatuma Nitna, it turns out that he actually memorized two sets of information and he had to keep them straight in his brain, right? This is the oral law, which I'm memorizing, and I'm not going to write it down ever. And this is the written law, which I'm memorizing, and I'm going to write it down, eventually. So I don't know. Does that answer your questions on that?
Well, sort of, because no matter which opinion you take, you have a problem.
What's the problem?
If you say it's from when he went up to Shemayim to get the Torah, he has to write all that catch up. No, he has to write from Bereshit on to the point of time that he's in. So when Hashem is speaking to him currently, he can write it down. Because
why does that bother you?
It's, because if you're saying it was when it happened, then obviously he had to have written things that happened beforehand that already have happened, and he's repeating history in essence.
Why does that bother you?
It just bothers me in terms of a sequence of events. If you're saying it's from that point, that means did Hashem redictate what he was told before?
So you don't have to say redictate. You don't have to say redictate. That God said, I'm going to tell you, sit down, Moshe. This is going to take a while. I'm now going to reveal to you, through dictation, you're going to eventually write it down, either right now or later, depending on that machloket, the whole cosmology, from the beginning of creation until this moment. Right, that's not the problem we talked about last week, where Moshe ostensibly is describing something that didn't happen yet. There's no problem God saying, I'm going to now dictate something that already happened, and you just write it down.
All right.
Okay, fine. Now, I just want to point out one other thing, which I don't want to discuss in any detail, that there's actually two halachot derived here. So one is the one we're going to focus on today, and that is the prohibition on writing down the oral law. The other is a prohibition on reciting by heart the written law, right? Because that's the other side of the coin here, it says, right? That things which were conveyed to be, in a written form, or they're eventually going to be written, that they cannot be recited orally. So that's something which is discussed a lot by the halachic authorities. What does that mean? I can't quote a pasuk by heart. So it's discussed at length. I don't want to get into it, but perhaps the easiest manifestation of that particular halacha would be in terms of a Baal Koreh. A Baal Koreh who may know the entire parsha by heart, right? He's not allowed to say it by heart. You have to read it from a cloth. Okay, so that would be just a kind of a more clear example of that particular halacha, which we're not going to focus on. Okay, so now the question is why? Why is it that the oral law had to be conveyed from generation to generation only in oral form, just memorized, and not written down? So we're going to take a look at a whole spectrum of explanations of this, really fascinating and significant explanations. And so we're going to start with Sefer Ikarim from Rabbi Yosef Albo, a very important medieval philosophical text. He says the following: Uleperush hazeh mehatorah shebichtav shemasar Moshe liYoshua Yoshua labayim acharav. And to this explanation of the Torah, the written Torah, that was handed down from Moshe to Yoshua and Yehoshua to those who came afterwards, Hu shekara'o Torah Sheba'al Peh. This is what is called the Torah Sheba'al Peh, the oral law. Right? He's just defining what we're talking about. It's the perush of the Torah, the explanation of the Torah, handed down from generation to generation. We call it Torah Sheba'al Peh. Now, the question is, why was it supposed to be only in oral form? At the end, we'll discuss what happened, right? No longer in oral form. We have a lot of books. Because it's impossible that this perush come in a written form. Why? Because it will eventually happen that there will arise doubt concerning this text. If you were to write down the oral law, the text of the oral law, the same doubt that will arise concerning the written law. He's saying something which is obvious and simple. The ambiguity of language. Why do we need a Torah Sheba'al Peh in the first place? Why need a Perush? It's because whenever you write something down, there's going to be ambiguity and lack of clarity in what was written down. So we need a Perush. So the only problem is, if you write down the Perush, and then someone reads that Perush, the same weakness, same ambiguity, the same lack of clarity, which characterized the written law, not because it has something to do with the particular lack of clarity of the written law, it's just written language. That's the problem with language. The same lack of clarity will happen with the written down oral law, the written down Perush.
When you say oral law, do you mean the Mishnah only? Like, what is the oral law?
Yeah, so so that's a very good question. It's more than the Mishnah. Let's just leave it. That's a question which we'll discuss another time. What do we mean really when we say oral law? It's bigger than the Mishnah. And what the Mishnah is and how it was formulated, so we'll discuss that another time. It's a very good question. So let's leave it vague for the moment. So Rabbi Yosef Albo is saying that explanatory material could not have been written down, or else it wouldn't fulfill its function, which is to clarify. Vayisarech perush leperush. What will happen is we'll have to create an explanation of the explanation, because we're going to have a written text which explains the Torah, but that written text, by virtue of the written word, is going to be ambiguous. We're going to have to write an explanation for that explanation. And so it'll go on forever. We'll have an explanation to explain the explanation, which is explaining the explanation, which in turn is explaining the explanation. Now, by the way, that's exactly what we have nowadays. You go into a Beit Midrash. You know what all those books are? They're explanations of explanations of explanations of explanations of explanations.
But isn't that often we're saying that God, who gave the Torah, couldn't give us a clear statement? Like, he couldn't be clear? Couldn't have a perfect book that we would always understand? Because we read it and say, oh, it doesn't really mean what it says. It really means something else. I mean, that's what's strange.
Yeah. So Rabbi Yosef Albo, I understand what you're saying. Rabbi Yosef Albo assumes that it's the very nature of language. It's like, God is the most perfect writer in the world. There's never been a greater author than God. The only problem is that since he has to speak to us, right, through language, language has an intrinsic limitation. Now you're going to see there's other explanations as well, but within this explanation itself, there is no way, due to the very nature, it's not a matter of being a better communicator or not. Even the greatest communicator, language has built within it a certain amount of ambiguity. Okay. Kamosha kara lechibur mishnayot. As he says, this is in fact what happened to the Mishnah, right? The Mishnah is supposedly the Perush of the Torah Shebichtav, of the written Torah. But what happened? That itself became unclear. Shehu Perush Torah Shebichtav. The Mishnah is supposed to be the explanation of the written Torah. Shenafal bo mina safek v'mevucha. And there fell in the text of the Mishnah itself doubt and confusion as to what it means. Ad shehu tzrach leperush acher. Until it needed another Perush. V'hu chibur haGemara. That's what the Gemara is. The Gemara is the Perush on the Perush. Shasa Ravashi lefaresh Mishnayot. And Ravashi was the editor who then edited the Gemara in order to explain the Mishnayot. V'chein haGemara. And look what happened to the Gemara, Shu Perush Mishnayot, which is supposed to be explaining the Mishnayot. Utzrach leperush gamkein. It itself needed to have a Perush. Rabu alaf a Perushim. And there are a multitude of explanations on the Gemara. V'chilukei hasfarot, and all kinds of different explanations. V'chein ala Perushim gamkein. And even the Perushim on the Gemara required Perushim. You know, there are Perushim on Rashi, there are Perushim on Tosfot. And it goes on and on and on. That our whole Jewish library is a Perush on a Perush on a Perush on a Perush. V'lazeh hu mivuar. And based on this, we can understand. It's impossible that the written Torah would be perfect unless there was accompanying it the oral law. And that's what's called Torah Sheba'al Peh. Now, what he doesn't really explain carefully is, well, how does maintaining the oral law orally fix the situation? I want to read one more sentence, which is part of the previous explanation. Then we're going to address that fundamental issue: is how does it help to maintain it orally? Valzeh hu shamru razal. Concerning this, our sages said the following: Lo karata Kadosh Baruch Hu brit, that a Kadosh Baruch Hu only made a covenant in Yisrael with the Jewish people, ela b'shvil Torah Sheba'al Peh, through the Torah Sheba'al Peh. Torah Sheba'al Peh is the real covenant between God and the Jewish people. V'zeh lefi she'ein mitziut lahavanat Torah. That's because there really cannot be any reality to the understanding of the Torah. It won't be found. There will not be found an understanding of the Torah, Shebitav, the written Torah, Eli im Torah Sheba'al Peh, unless there's a Torah Sheba'al Peh. Hey, I want to take one step back. So how does it help to maintain it orally? So the answer is the following: that when I convey information orally, now I'm still speaking in language, right? I'm trying to explain something to somebody. Well, language is ambiguous, but the advantage is if I have to tell you orally, that means you can ask a question. You can say, what do you mean by that word? And then I'll tell you. And the person who's on the receiving end will say, I don't get it. Can you say it in a different way? I'll say it in a different way. Through the give and take from student and teacher, between student and teacher, which is necessitated by the fact that it's Torah Sheba'al Peh, has to be conveyed orally, mouth to mouth, right? So that then necessitates, through the give and take, the live give and take, the dynamic give and take between teacher and student, that there will emerge clarity as to the intent, which would not be the case if you go to the library, and take out a book, the Torah Sheba'al Peh. You sit by yourself and read it. It can mean anything. And by the way, obviously, look what happened. Look what happened to the written Torah, right? For reasons we'll discuss later, it's going to be mentioned, a very interesting source, that we have the written Torah revered by much of the world's population. The Christians theoretically revere the written Torah, except for look how many different sects of Christianity there are. All of them thinking that that the so-called Old Testament is sacred. If you don't have a Torah Sheba'al Peh, through the process of give and take between the generations and teachers and students, which clarifies the meaning of the written law, you end up having almost any possible religion based upon this sacred text. Okay, so that's the first explanation given by Rabbi Yosef Abel. Any questions on his first explanation? Okay, we're good. Now we're going to go on. He gives a second explanation. This explanation is also really profound. So we're reading now from what it says Va'od, right here, Va'od. He says the following: Va'od, lefi she'i efshar she'tiyeh Torah Hashem Yitbarach Shlema, ba'ofen shetaspik b'chol zmanim. He says, furthermore, it's impossible that the Torah of Hashem be perfect in a manner that would suffice for all time. Lefi she'apratim hamitchadshim tamid binyanei ha'anashim k'mishpatim v'hadvarim hanifalim hem rabim ma'od mishichalalam b'sefer. Why is it that the Torah cannot suffice? It's because the world is dynamic. Things are always changing. Circumstances change. lawsuits are brought that were never brought before. It's impossible to write a book, right? How many pages can a book have? It's impossible to write a book which would anticipate every single possible circumstance that had ever come up that would tell you what Hashem wants, how to behave in that circumstance. That's impossible. That's impossible. So there can never be a book which would be a guidebook for every possible circumstance. Impossible. Al kain nitnu leMoshe v'Sinai kolalim. That's why there was given to Moshe not just a text, but a methodology, principles, nirmazu b'Torah b'ktsara, that are hinted at in a very brief way in the Torah, kedei she'al yadam yotziu hachachamim shebechol dor v'dor hapratim mitchadshim. That by using that technique, the sages in every generation will be able to derive from the Torah all of the different ways to address renewed circumstances, unique circumstances, things that didn't exist in the past. The Hema Devrim Shenizkaru b'Torah Kohanim. These are the things which are mentioned in the collection of Midrash called Torah Kohanim, b'Tchilato, in the beginning, b'Ota Braita Hamatchelet Rabbi Yishmael Omer. Right, this is familiar to everybody who davens. In the beginning of the Sidur, there are the 13 hermeneutical rules of Rabbi Yishmael. That what's that all about, right? So nidreshet mikol v'chomer umigzei rashala, these different techniques. Ba'al yedei otam hadrachim, by using this methodology, ol echad mehem yodei kol ma shelo nimtza b'Torah, we can then derive that which is not explicitly written in the Torah. What's Rabbi Yosef Albo saying? Yosef Albo is saying something very profound. Judaism is not a closed book, right? It's how does Hashem want us to live our lives? What is the most ethical, holy way to respond to any circumstance that will ever arise throughout the entire future history of the world? Can't write a book like that. But you can have a methodology. If we were to write down the Torah Sheba'al Peh, you know what would happen? People would treat that as if Judaism is a closed book. If it's not written down, then we don't know what to do. God didn't address it because all the information is contained in the book. Judaism is not a text. We could even say Torah, in the larger sense of the word, is not a text. It's a technique. Torah Sheba'al Peh is not written down because it's not a text. It's a technique. It's a way that we can then extrapolate from the Torah Shebiktav to be able to address the proper way of behaving in any given circumstance. By the way, the critique that the liberal movements have of orthodoxy, which I think is certainly not fully justified, and maybe to a certain extent it's a little bit justified, is that there's this perception, and like I said, maybe to a certain extent there's some truth to it, that if you treat Judaism as a closed book, as a text, which is starts on page 1 and ends on page 100, then it's frozen. And we no longer have the ability to maintain this vitality, to be able to address an ever-changing world and to know how to behave and act in that ever-changing world in a way which reflects the divine will.
Well, Rabbi, these 13 Hamidical rules, they maybe should be, unless they are, somehow in the written word. Are they D'oraita or D'Rabbanan? And whatever they are, we have 13 from Yishmael, and then 7 from Rabbi Akiva, and others from other people. It's like, what does that mean?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So I don't want to go into the detail of those specific hermeneutical rules, particularly because we don't understand them anymore. Going back to something I said before.
Well, where are they from? Where are they from?
I'm sorry?
What's their origin? D'oraita?
Yeah. So that's a whole discussion, which I don't. But suffice it to say that I believe Rabbi Yosef Albo, to tell you the truth, I think it was a sort of a mistake that he cited. I believe he meant that that's an example of how we have a technique to extrapolate from the Torah, but it's not limited to that. The real point is his sort of, I would say, more conceptual idea that don't treat the Torah as a closed book, that if it's not written down, then it's irrelevant to God's will. That by creating this thing called Torah Sheba'al Peh, that it maintains the sense of dynamism and the ability to address an ever-changing world. So I think that that's his important point, and I think the issue of the specific derivation of these hermeneutical rules and their application, I think that's an important issue, but I think his point really is larger than that particular thing. Okay, so far we've had two explanations of why the Torah Sheba'al was not allowed to be written down. The first is because once you write it down, it's ambiguous. The second explanation is don't write it down because that'll make Judaism a closed book. It'll rob it of its dynamism. Okay, now we're going to take a look at a midrashic text, the Psita Rabbati, which actually deals with also this idea of why it was forbidden to write down the Torah Sheba'al Peh. But we're going to skip the beginning, just where my cursor says, I'm Rabbi Yehuda Rabbi Shalom. Okay, just from there. I'm Rabbi Yehuda Rabbi Shalom. Bikesh Moshe shetehei Mishnah bichtav. Moshe asked that the Mishnah, this doesn't mean the book, the Mishnah, but the oral teachings. The oral teachings should be taught, that he should be able to write it down. Moshe himself said, Oi, there's so much to remember. Maybe I could write it down, God. Is that okay? V'tzafa HaKadosh Baruch Hu she'umot atidin litargem et Torah. So HaKadosh Baruch Hu saw in the future that the nations are going to translate the Torah, right, into Greek. V'liot korim ba'yevanit. They're going to read it in Greek. V'omrim, and they're going to say, there's a printing error here, Anu Hem Yisrael, we're Jews. We are the real Jews. Here's our Bible. Amar lo HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So HaKadosh Baruch Hu, based upon this fact of what's going to happen in the future, he said to Moshe, Moshe tedino mot liyot omrim anu hem Yisrael. Moshe, this is no good. In the future, there's going to be these people. They're going to say that they're the Jews. Anu hem banav shemakom. They're going to say that we are the sons of Hashem. V'Yisrael omrim anu hem banav shemakom. And the Jews are going to say, wait a second, we're the children of Hashem. V'achshav hamoznaim muyanim. And the whole system of justice is going to become distorted. Who is the real son of God? Who are the nation that is God's chosen nation? Who's Israel? Amar HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So in order to avoid this problem with the be in the future, so we're going to come up with a system. So Hashem will say, Lu'umot, to the nations who claim that they're the real Israel, Matem omrim ta'atem banai. What do you say to prove that you are my children? I only know those people who have the secret code in their hand. Ubanai, right? Ubani, he's my kid. He has to have the secret password. Amrulo, so the nations will say to God, what's the secret code? Amar lehem zeh Mishnah. It's the Mishnah. It's the oral law. V'kol heach lidrosh, and how to interpret the Torah. This is a really fascinating midrash here. So this midrash is saying that in the future, there's going to become a religion, and they're going to say they're real Israel. By the way, it's very clear what he's referring to. What religion is he referring to that claims that they are Israel?
Christianity.
Christianity. This is not imaginary, this midrash. This is it's explicit in Christianity. Christianity has explicit doctrines that say that they are the new Israel, that they are the Israel of the Spirit. We're only Israel of the flesh, right? We're like dinosaurs. We're just material Israel. But the true Israel is Christianity, right? That is, I'm sure you've heard this idea of replacement theology. That's what replacement theology is. That Christianity is saying that we're replacing the Jews, right? This was, we are now the real Israel, and we are God's chosen people. So God says the result of that, besides that is not true, is that a creation of a religion which is a distortion of God's will. The only way to maintain authenticity is through Torah Sheba'al Peh. Torah Sheba'al Peh is the authentic expression of Torah. And that's something that we keep close to our chest, right? In order to preserve the authenticity of who we are and what we stand for. By the way, it's really interesting. You know, there's this whole movement now of Christians that are interested in the Jewish roots of Christianity. And there's all these sites out there, websites of Hebrew for Christians and Christians who are studying passages in the Talmud, etc. And of course, with ArtScroll now, you know, everything's accessible. And I'll tell you a quick story. It looks like we may not be able to finish this analysis today, since I think the next rabbi is waiting. But I'll finish with a quick story, and then we'll finish this topic next week. So I was once, when I was the rabbi in Sacramento, so there was an event at Chabad, and I wasn't exactly sure where Chabad was. I had to walk to it. So it was on Shabbat morning after davening, and I was going to walk over to Chabad to their Kiddush. And I wasn't exactly sure how to walk there. And I see some people walking down the street with tzitzis, beards, and I know they didn't belong to my shul. There's only two Orthodox places to daven in Sacramento, either the shul that has the rabbi or Chabad, that's it. So I just assumed, you know, tzitzis and beards, yarmulkes. You know, I said, you know, Shabbat Shalom, you know, can you tell me where Chabad is? And they said, we don't know. I said, what? Like, they're not members of my shul, and they don't know where Chabad is.
Frisco kids.
So then I realized these are, you know, what they call Messianic Christians. So Christians wearing tzitzis, yarmulke, beard, and they have churches where they have actually Sifrei Torah, and they wear talesim, etc. Right? And obviously, even though there's some kind of external manifestations of Judaism, they're certainly not practicing nor believing in an authentic Jewish way. And the only way to preserve that authenticity is through the Torah Sheba'al Peh, which we keep to ourselves. But once it becomes ArtScroll and available to all, then you can walk down the street on Shabbos morning, encounter Jews with beards and yarmulkes. I said Jews. We're not Jews, we're Christians. Well, I'm sorry?
Isn't that the case today? They can order their ArtScroll and learn it very well.
I didn't hear.
They can order their ArtScroll and learn it very well. I mean,
you know, it's just the audio is distorted.
They can order their ArtScroll and learn it very well. It's a written book today.
Exactly the point. And exactly. That's the point of the Psita Rabati here. That it could be that there's a certain critique of when Torah Sheba'al Peh becomes so accessible, it's good for Jews. It makes it easier for us to learn. But it has a downside, and that's Psita Rabati. It allows for access to the Torah Sheba'al Peh in a way that accentuates and strengthens the fraudulent claim that we are the true Israel, that Christianity is the true Israel. Okay, with that, we'll stop, and we will go on with several more really fascinating approaches to this issue next week. And then we'll also discuss, well, what happened? How come, in fact, we do write it down? To the extent that we even have ArtScroll, which makes everything not only written down, but incredibly accessible to anybody who can speak English. But we'll continue with that, Bezrat Hashem, next week.
Thank you, Rabbi Zapf.
My pleasure.
Oh.
Are you ready, Arthur? Yeah.